Hello, Tom. It's nice to be interviewing you again. Today we're going to talk about how you have come to write your My Big Toe trilogy. The things and the qualifications that led you to writing this. It was known 100 years ago that consciousness was the fundamental reality. It is only logical, I think, that someone such as yourself needed to come along and unite relativity and quantum mechanics in a big picture. My Big Toe. R equals I is the identity you give MBT. Simpler but perhaps more profound than E equals MC squared. Reality is information. We need to interpret it through our experiences, consciousness, and free will. It is in this exchange of information that we gain experience. Now, Einstein has said the only source of knowledge is experience. He had some clues in 100 years ago that consciousness was also fundamental reality.
He did.
It is your experience in the LCS, and that's larger consciousness system, that's one of the terms that you give it from your scientific viewpoint, that has led you to derive better physics. You hope to rewrite, how about you will rewrite quantum mechanics with your recent physics experiments. The weird science will be just science.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping to rewrite quantum mechanics. Of course, I have some experiments out there that most people will know about. That's a set of quantum mechanics experiments that will lend very, very strong evidence to the concept that this reality is information-based. It is a virtual reality. And it will also lend some evidence to the idea that consciousness is the computer. If you have a virtual reality that's a computed reality, then you have to have a computer that's doing the computing. So these experiments will lend a lot of evidence to both of those concepts, mostly to the concept this is a virtual reality, but also some evidence to consciousness as the computer. So if those experiments work the way I have predicted and the way I hope they do, then this will move things forward in science and in physics, I think, quite a bit once they're digested. I mean, that'll take years. They have to be done, and they have to be redone, and they have to be redone again by, a dozen institutions. They have to be talked about, and that will take time. It's not going to happen real quickly, but over some years, hopefully, this will help encourage, help move along a process that began probably back with John Archibald Wheeler, who, in the first part of his career, everything was particles. The second part of the middle of his career, everything was fields. The last part of his career, everything was information. He coined the it from bit. So he was probably one of the first physicists who stood up and said, this is a virtual reality, it's all about information. And then, of course, Edward Fredkin came along, sometime after that with the similar idea that this is a computed reality. But they were really the beginning. But now that just goes back, I don't know, let's see, I don't know the date when Wheeler got to that conclusion, but it wasn't that long ago. He just died in like 2008, I think, was the day. So he's fairly current. He also was alive in time to work with Einstein and to work with Bohr. He and Bohr, wrote papers together. So he was one of the originals in the 1920s. He was a young guy then, but he was right out there trying to, learn what there was to learn. And I don't know that we've seen a physicist who is of the caliber of Wheeler since then. Yes, Einstein and others have been brilliant in the things that they have done, but Bohr was truly a scientist in the sense of he was always open-minded, he was always skeptical, and he did not become a slave to the status quo, to what everybody else believed wasn't all that important to him. It had to make sense to him. That's why he changed from particles to fields to information, because he went wherever the evidence was. He didn't stay there because that's what everybody else thought. So in that sense, he was probably one of the best scientists that we've seen, in a century. Not that others haven't been brilliant. Einstein did some out-of-the-box thinking as well, and so did Bohr and the rest of them. But they didn't necessarily keep working at it and take it as far as Wheeler did. But now Wheeler was a young guy then, so Bohr and Heisenberg and Wigner and Planck, they were a little more mature in their years. So they're pushing the ideas forward. You can understand they didn't get as much done as Wheeler did, who had another 20 or 30 years of career after that to work on these ideas. And it wasn't until later in his life that he came to information as the central thing. But Wheeler was really the beginning, I think, intellectually of this. He called it from bit. And though there were a few others maybe before that, of course we can name Buddha as one of the originals for saying this reality is all an illusion. But he really wasn't a scientist, and it really wasn't science he was talking about. This was more poetry. And it was a thing that the Buddha experienced and he knew as a fact. But it was an intuitive fact, not a logical fact. So that makes it poetry,
now,
not science.
We've done an interview that, speaking of Wheeler, going back to Wheeler, we've done an interview that where you explained how the two physicists in Australia performed Wheeler's thought experiment.
Yes, these experiments keep turning up and up and up, lots of them. I just read one recently, and I can't quote you the name or who did it or even where it was done, but it was several physicists that were doing kind of a double slit experiment. And they were plowing new ground. They did something that had never been done before. And the conclusion to their paper was, we have demonstrated that light is neither a particle nor a wave. That was their conclusion. Their results could not have existed if light was a wave and could not exist if light was a particle. They said it's something else. Well, bravo, guys. Of course it's something else. It's information. Information is not a particle. Information is not a wave. But they haven't found out what it is. They just could do an experiment that showed them what it's not. Okay, so yes, these experiments keep pouring in. Month by month, they're piling up. That's why there's more and more people who are considering this idea of a virtual reality seriously, in science, because the evidence is stacking up. No, it's not a particle. No, it's not a wave. And no, it's not sometimes a particle and sometimes a wave. It's something different altogether.
Now, Einstein and Bohr did realize that consciousness was fundamental.
They did. And I often quote him in some of my workshop videos where Einstein says, yes, I understand that consciousness is fundamental to our understanding. But, he says, I have no idea how to formulate that into science. Now, I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what he says. This was in a letter to Baum, another physicist he worked with, both at Princeton, I believe. And in this letter, he says, yes, consciousness is key here, but how do we write consciousness in an equation that makes sense in our physics? I have no idea what elementary ideas that I can use to approach that. So it was like, yeah, we know this is true, but we don't know how to go forward with it in science. And that was where they got stuck. And that's why 20, 30, 50, almost 100 years later, we're still stuck, because people don't know how to go forward with that idea that consciousness is at the core, but how do we work that into science? Well, of course, the obvious answer to that is that yes, this is a virtual reality, just like the experiments are saying. Yes, information is at the core, just like the double slit has always said for almost 100 years. And yes, consciousness is the computer that's computing all of this. It all works together. And then once you have that big picture, the rest of it just falls out. That's where this idea for a new quantum mechanics falls out, because once you have that picture, then you don't have to calculate the answer to a quantum mechanics problem. You can logically derive it. You see, it's not just a mathematical thing. Up to now, quantum mechanics is shut up and calculate, right? That's quantum mechanics. Don't ask me why it's like that. It's not logical. It's beyond logic. Just calculate the answer. And nobody has a clue what that answer might be until the calculation's done, because there's no other way to get there. Well, once you understand virtual reality and that consciousness is a computer, now quantum mechanics becomes a logical science like every other science. It's not a weird science. You can look at it, do the logic, and there's the answer. You don't really have to calculate it. All you have to do is understand the logic of it and how it works. And once you understand, my big toe and the way this reality works, then that perspective that's needed to see quantum mechanics as a normal science just falls out. It's not that hard to do. It's really not a big deal. It's just a better perspective that lets you see, the right answer. You have to have the right perspective or you can't find the solution.
All right, now that these two very distinguished scientists, Einstein and Bohr, understood a long time ago that consciousness was at the fundamental reality.
Yeah, and add to them Wigner and Heisenberg and Planck. Add all of those guys. You can find things in their writings that say, yes, consciousness is at the core of this. I mean, the whole group of the super scientists that created quantum mechanics all understood that there was something else to reality than particles and waves. This was different. But they didn't know what, so they came up with this Band-Aid fix by saying, well, sometimes it's a particle and sometimes a wave. Well, nobody really liked that. What do you mean reality is sometimes this way and sometimes that way? That's obviously a kludge. That's what you do when you really don't have a good answer. You kind of stick a Band-Aid over it and say, well, okay, we don't understand this, but here are the facts that we measure. Sometimes it acts this way, sometimes it acts that way, and we have no clue why. It's just not rational. Well, they have the wrong perspective. A materialist perspective comes to that conclusion. And they were all materialists going into this. They realized that was wrong, but didn't know how to solve the problem, didn't know how to get out of it.
This is actually the key to this whole interview. They didn't know how to solve it. Now that consciousness is beginning to be accepted as the fundamental reality, as your MBT theory proposed when you began writing it in 1998, it's more important than ever for physicists and scientists to understand a little more about who you are and why you were able to derive our physics from consciousness. You've often told us about your beginnings of consciousness research in the 1970s with Robert Monroe, and just a little bit about your childhood. I think every few decades or 100 years, let's say, since it's been 100 years, there comes along someone with the unique qualifications that shakes up the status quo. We need that every once in a while. And offers their work to bring humanity closer to answering the big questions and evolving in a positive direction. I think the single most difficult thing for most physicists and scientists to understand about your work, now there are exceptions, there are several scientists who do understand where you're coming from because they've experienced as you have. But what they need to understand about your work is that your research began in the fundamental reality that is consciousness. Then secondarily, you derived and answered the questions, the so-called hard problems of physics that were previously unanswered. Your quality of consciousness has been earned through the many life experience package you've experienced. Were you always aware that you had a mission to help humanity towards a better understanding of our reality and towards a more peaceful, loving path?
No, not always, but let me go back and comment on some of what you said just earlier.
Okay.
And that is that you are right. What I was able to do that most scientists have not been able to do is I have been able to have experience and, can we say, repeatable, consistent experience in the larger consciousness system. Now, the larger consciousness system is non-physical to us, to we, the avatars here in this physical universe. So in this consciousness space, you might call it, in this other reality dimension that is consciousness, that is non-physical to our physical reality, I was able to do research there, to do science there, to try to figure out how consciousness worked. I wasn't trying to figure out how physics worked. I was trying to figure out how consciousness worked and make a model of consciousness that was scientific, that was credible, that answered all the questions and explained all of the experience. So it was that ability that was really the big difference. Had I just stayed in the physical, had I not been able to get an inside picture as well as an outside picture, I wouldn't have been able to put all of this together. So that's what made it different. That's what made my experience different than others. Now I also have the advantage over Bohr and Einstein and Heisenberg and Planck and even over Wheeler to some extent for his first part of his career, is that in my lifetime, virtual reality has become a thing. It started as a simple little games like Space Invaders and Pong and that sort of stuff, and they were almost hard to call a virtual reality, but they were that. They were very simple little virtual realities with their own little rule sets. And they then turned into much more interesting and much more detailed realities that mostly kids, but adult kids also, played these virtual reality games. And virtual reality has been expanding and growing as a concept. Okay, and that probably started in, I don't know, old Pong probably goes back to the late 70s, maybe early 80s, and Space Invaders were probably, early, 1980, and that kind of, so they were in that time frame. Now, Wheeler was still alive then, but these were new concepts and we hadn't really seen where they could go. So that's an advantage I had over, Einstein and Bohr and Planck and Wigner and, that group, didn't have those concepts. So this whole idea about information and virtual reality was more accessible by me than it was by those smart guys that developed quantum mechanics. So they were stuck, but they didn't have the concepts to work with. So I had two advantages. I was born later than they were, and therefore I had the virtual reality as a concept. I had a career creating virtual realities, if you will, not in the sense of games, but in the sense of writing simulations. So I understood, how information can be used to simulate reality. That was part of what I did for a living. And I was able to explore consciousness and explore it in a very scientific way. In other words, let's say we gather data. You can gather data about probable futures, about pasts. You can gather data about the present. When you gather data about things going on in the present, that's called remote viewing. You're viewing something that's here now. And many of these things you can check. You can remote view what's in a particular spot, and then you can go look at Google Maps and see what's in that spot and see if you got it right. You can Google what's going on in somebody's house at a particular day. and they are maybe going to do something there, maybe jump up and down or dance or something, and you need to find out what it is they're doing. You can remote view numbers on the blackboard in another room, in another building, in another state, and then you can see, did you get the right numbers? These are things you can do that you can check. So they're evidential things. Well, then you do all these with your mind from this consciousness. These are things that consciousness can do. These are things you do when you are part of the larger consciousness system. Well, I was able to kind of let my sense data go and travel in this consciousness system and explore it, and what you could do there and what you couldn't, and what information you could get, and was that information evidential? And if it was, change a variable. Do it a little differently. Be in a little different altered state this time, or approach it differently, or have a different process for gathering information, and see how did that affect the result. And then change another variable, you see, and see how that affected the result. And if you do this hundreds and hundreds of times, changing variables, seeing how results are affected, you begin to understand how it works. In other words, you begin to create a logical process inside this larger consciousness system. Whereas other folks did one of two things. They never got into that larger consciousness system. They were just locked here in the physical reality. And the only other reality they ever visited was their dream reality, or maybe a daydream reality. But that wasn't consistent, and it wasn't something they could do experiments in. The other group would be those who did explore the larger conscious system, but they didn't do it as science. They just explored it. They had experience. So it comes back as all subjective information. They didn't create any objective information while they were in this larger consciousness system. So they came back with lots of stories. Bob Monroe, was one of those. He explored it, came back with lots of stories, and he was a very good explorer. He reported just what he experienced, but they were his experiences. They were all subjective. They were all his interpretation of the data he received while he was there. You see, and his interpretation is based on his own knowledge, his own limitations, his own fears, his own beliefs. All of that is part of that subjective interpretation. So we had those two groups, those that were locked in the physical and those that were exploring the non-physical, exploring consciousness. And I'll just call consciousness the non-physical, because you can look at any of my other videos where I talk about this subject, and you'll see that consciousness has to be non-physical to this reality frame when you look at this as a virtual reality. I won't go into that here.
Well, Einstein said that you cannot solve a problem from the subset in which the problem exists.
That's exactly true, right. So you're not going to solve these problems just from a physical viewpoint. You're not going to see the better quantum mechanics, that is not weird, but just logical science from, a material viewpoint. That's not where the answer is. It's not a particle, it's not a wave, it's information. You see, information is not material. It's information. It's only information when you interpret it. Ones and zeros are material, words in a book are material, but it takes a consciousness to take that data and turn it into information. So though data can be material, data can be transmitted, data can be moved around, but only a consciousness can interpret the data and find information. Information is not physical. Anyway, so we had that group that was exploring the non-physical, exploring consciousness, if you will, the larger consciousness system, and we had those that were stuck here. Neither one really had what it takes to do better physics. You have to be able to do objective research in that larger consciousness system before you begin to understand what affects what. What is primary, what is secondary, what's fundamental, and what is downstream from fundamental. What is created from other things that are fundamental. And one of the first conclusions I came to from my experience was consciousness is fundamental. The physical reality is not. That was an obvious conclusion from my research. Those people locked in the physical could not come to that conclusion. Those people exploring the larger consciousness system only knew that there were two different realities that they could exist in, but they had no real ideas about how those realities were connected in a scientific way. So yes, that was the difference that I brought to this subject, is that I happen to be able to, and I was in the right place at the right time, and probably the right person with the right background to meet Bob Monroe, learn to master the outer body so that I could go there, do that whenever I wanted, and I could do it precisely so I could repeat things. And at the same time was a physicist so that I could put all these concepts together in some kind of scientific way. And when I thought I understood it, what I thought I understood wasn't physics. When I first thought I understood it, what I had was a theory of consciousness. That was what I was going for, right, when I wrote the books. But I knew that consciousness was fundamental and the physical world was a derivative of that consciousness. My experiments there had proven that to me, okay? So, with that understanding, you see, I had a different viewpoint. And my books were written as a theory of consciousness, but as I wrote in those books, the physical will be derivable from this fundamental thing, because I knew it was derived, but I didn't know how to derive it. It wasn't until 2 years or so after the publication of my books that Ted Vollers, who runs the forum for me, he said a few things to me, and that just jogged my mind. It was that little catalyst I needed, that aha. Now, he wasn't talking about quantum mechanics or anything else like that, but it jogged my mind, and yes, suddenly the idea of how the double slit experiment was clear. I got that, and I said, oh, well, that's how that works. Now, let's see if I can understand other mysteries. So I started thinking about, well, relativity is the next big science, right? Relativity and quantum mechanics are the two big, sciences in physics. They kind of subsume everything else. And I thought about relativity, and in a couple of days, I got another aha, of course. Every virtual reality has a speed limit. The speed limit is, every virtual reality is computed. It's a dynamic reality, things change, so there's a delta t element, and there is a delta x, if you want, a delta volume element, because you have things happening in a three-dimensional space. So that defines the delta t and the delta v, delta volume, delta x, whatever, delta distance, let's put it that way. How small those are define the resolution of the simulation. I mean, it's just that simple. If you need a finer grain simulation, then whether it's finer grain in space, then you make smaller delta t's, delta y's, and delta x's. And if you want it finer grain in time, you make smaller delta t's. And you pay for that. The smaller delta x's, y's, z's, and t's are, the more calculations you have to do to create this reality. It's more computer power, more throughput, because you're calculating a lot more points, a lot finer resolution of points, you see. But the maximum speed limit is you can move through 1 pixel of space for 1 pixel of time. You can move 1 unit of delta x for 1 unit of delta t. The maximum speed limit is delta x over delta t. That's the maximum because that's the resolution of the simulation. So every simulation, World of Warcraft and The Sims, both have speed limits based on their resolution. Now, yes, theoretically you could maybe move 10 delta x's in a delta t, but that's called teleportation. And that's not a smooth, consistent, coherent, contiguous simulation. Okay, that's one where things jump around, disappear from here and appear someplace else. It used to be here, now it's 10 pixels over, you see. That's not the kind of reality that we have. So that's not the kind of realities that we create. Any reality that's going to be a good schoolhouse, it's going to be a good place to learn, needs to be consistent. Needs to be something that's dependable. Things can't just fly around in funny ways, and disappear places and reappear places. That doesn't have enough consistency to be a valuable experience. Consistent experience is valuable experience. So the reality can only move 1 delta x for every delta t. It can't move any faster than that. It can't move another delta x before the next delta t comes along, you see. So every virtual reality created by anyone, anywhere, has a speed limit. Ours is no different. So why is c a constant? Because it's a virtual reality and it has a resolution. Okay, so that's the answer to that. And then once I got that, you see, now the rest of relativity is basically derived out of this one fact, that c is a constant is really the key concept in relativity. All of special relativity falls out of that fact with a little algebra. Now Einstein wanted to get gravity into it, and the speed of light being a constant is still the major driver there, the major player, other than Einstein came up with a geometric description of gravity, as opposed to the older description, which is, gravitation was proportional to the product of the two masses attracting each other divided by the distance between their centers squared. That was the earlier model of gravitation. And with this geometric model he created, he was able to come up with some other things that allowed him to compute the effect of c being a constant on gravity and other things. So it was a better model. It was a deeper model. It wasn't quite so limited as the old model of gravity. C being a constant just fell into place. Then I started looking at other things like tunneling. Well, tunneling is where particles just appear outside of what's called in physics a potential whale. It's like a barrier they can't get through. It'd be like you have everybody locked in their cell, but occasionally inmates appear outside the jail, with no explanation. The door never has been opened. There's no breakout. They're always locked, but just occasionally they appear outside the jail. Well, that's what this tunneling was about. Particles would appear outside a barrier, and the barrier didn't have holes in it. The barrier wasn't let down. They just do that. Well, when you understand how virtual reality works as a random draw from the distribution of probabilities, okay, it's a distribution of all the possibilities by probability. So it's the probability of all the possibilities, and then you take a random draw out of that, which means the things most likely are what happen most of the time. But there are sometimes that random draw pulls something out under the tail of the curve, something that's only a 1 in a million occurrence. But if you have billions and billions of particles, because particles are small, you can get a lot of particles, in a bottle. You have billions and billions of particles in there, then that 1 in a million draw happens fairly frequently. You see? Because a billion is 1,000 million. So if it's only 1 in a million, then if you have a billion, you're going to have 1,000 particles that are going to come out every time you take a billion draws onto where that particle is in there. Sometimes they're just going to appear outside the bottle, outside their container. And indeed, that's what happens. It's just a probability problem in the way that the virtual reality works, and so on. I started working through all of the paradoxes in physics. Why, these things that just don't make any sense. Well, quantum mechanics was the first one, relativity was the second one. Those were the two big sciences. And then all these other little effects in quantum mechanics and other places. And I found that if you have the perspective of a virtual reality, then there's an easy solution to all these paradoxes. and you don't introduce a single other paradox into the system. It's like you can solve all the existing paradoxes without creating any new ones, because this model of mine only has two assumptions. Consciousness exists, evolution exists. Everything else is logically derived, deductively derived. Okay? So that, that let me kind of demonstrate, and it made me feel a lot better. I got a nice warm fuzzy feeling that this theory of consciousness was really correct, because the physics is downhill in the flow. Logic, consequences, flow. You have some parameters, we call them axioms or statements that you make, and then there's a lot of consequences of these statements. Well, if any of your initial assumptions or axioms are wrong, then those logical consequences get goofy. They're wrong too. So the farther down you go, down the logic flow, the farther you get there, the more likely goofiness is going to show up if you've got anything wrong. So now the physics is all the way down at the end of the logic flow, and it works. So that gave me a warm fuzzy that the theory of consciousness worked, that it was a good theory. Now still, it's a theory, it's a model. And I say in my books over and over, don't confuse the model of reality with reality, and don't believe what I tell you about reality. You have to experience it for yourself. So I'm not trying to add another layer of belief onto all the layers of belief that already exist out there. I just offer another way of looking at reality, and this other way of looking at reality happens to solve the outstanding physics problems, the outstanding theology problems, the outstanding metaphysical problems. It solves the problems, the paradoxes that you find in biology. The things that Bruce does.
Bruce Lipton.
Lipton, yeah. It explains why they work that way. Mind is primary, the body is secondary. You see, they explain the things that
the neuroscientists.
Neuroscientists.
University of Virginia.
Yeah, University of Virginia,
Studies.
and there was another one out of California.
UC Irvine, I think that's Donald Hoffman.
Yeah, Donald Hoffman. They've all come up with things that are basically paradoxes. They come up with things that reality is not at all what we think it is. Yeah, Hoffman says reality is an interface, just an interface to something else, deeper and more fundamental. You see, well, yes, of course it is. He's talking about a virtual reality, and consciousness is what's more fundamental. So, but those things seem paradoxical. Anyway, there's lots of paradoxes that we have. Why should a little boy who's 8 years old or so know all about an airplane that was flown in World War I or World War II, whenever it was, the pilot's name, what happened, how it got shot down, and all the facts about the planes? Why would he know this? How would he know this? That's a paradox. We have all of the near-death experience paradoxes. How does somebody who's being operated on float up above the operation table and then tell the doctors later what they were talking about, what they said? We even have cases now where they've put numbers up on top of the light frames, in the operating rooms to see when people get out if they can read them. I don't know whether they've had much success with that, but I expect they've had a few successes with that. Well, it only takes one to create a paradox, you see. So there's lots of paradoxes going on in the world, both in the metaphysical side, in the paranormal side, and in the neuroscience side, in the physics side, biology. All these things have their own paradoxes, and this view of this being a virtual reality based on information where consciousness, a computer, solves all of them without creating any other paradoxes.
Well, this brings us back to Einstein's quote that we started off with: the only source of knowledge is experience. And clearly you're different from other physicists. Your work is not guessing, you've experienced it, and you've done repeated experiments to test it. You don't need to find the answers to the nature of our reality in the material world, because as a child, You knew and experienced the larger reality. So my question today, Tom, what were your earliest
Your
memories?
next question. Your next question
My
today,
next
Tom.
question. So we're going to go back a little further than we have before. What are your earliest memories of how our reality works?
Well, I didn't know. I early on had experience in getting out of this physical reality and finding myself in a larger reality. I had that experience, but I had no idea how it worked. I just know it did. It was something that I learned to do. And this is typical of children the age I was. You see, I was 5, 6, 7 in that frame someplace, or during those years when I was 5, 6, 7 is when this took place. And it just happened. Well, kids report these kinds of things, at that age all the time. They have non-physical friends. It's just not that exceptional. And they go other places. They see things. They make comments. There's a little child now. I can't remember who it was. Somewhere, somebody in the extended family of mine who makes comments like, "When I was an adult, I saw da 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 da." And of course the parents say, "When you were an adult, are you an adult?" And they say, "No, I'm a child now, but when I was an adult." And kids come out with this sort of stuff, and it's just not that rare. Kids have a connection with a larger reality. Well, I had a connection with a larger reality, and I learned to get around in it. I learned how it functioned. I learned not only how to get there and get back, but things to do while you were there, things to be. And I practiced figuring it out. If I do this, what happens? So even then, I guess I was practicing figuring it out, how to work with it, how to deal with it. And I had some teachers that helped me do that helped me figure it out. So yes, that was when I was very young, but again, not exceptional. Lots of kids do that. So I was doing that, but I had no clue, how it all fit together. I just knew that there was this other place I could go when I did certain things, and that it was a fun place, and it was a place where I could do things I couldn't do here, and I learned things that seemed to be important, and I could even see things. I could even do like the remote viewing. I could travel around and see things. I could go float out through the wall of my house, float around the neighborhood, and I could see what was going on. And I'd get evidence that that indeed was going on that night while I supposedly was sleeping, because I saw it. I knew it was real because the information I got was valuable. See, that's my way of finding out, is it real? Does the information work? Can you read the numbers on that blackboard? Can you see what's at that remote viewing site? You see, if you can, then it's real. If you can do this hundreds and hundreds of times and you are, 80 or 90% correct in what you see, then it's not just chance. You're not just a lucky guesser. There's something real here. So I knew it was real, but I didn't know where it was, how it was, and I never questioned it, actually. It just seemed to me that it was just natural. Sure, our reality is multidimensional, and there's this reality, and there's the dream reality, and then there's this physical reality, and you can play and learn and grow in all of them, and that seemed to me like just the way reality was. I suppose the bigger surprise was that everybody else didn't see it that way. You see?
How did your family interact with you? Were there any constraints put on you that interfered with
No, none whatsoever. Matter of fact, I suspect that I very quickly, and maybe I was even told by people who worked with me in that state, who were in that state themselves. These would be non-physical entities of some sort. And I probably was even given the hint, other people aren't going to understand. Keep it to yourself. You really don't need to share this information. But I probably did share some of it, and my parents were always very open, and they would have said, "Oh, really? Tell me about that." But, they wouldn't have tried to squish it or do anything like that. They wouldn't have tried to push it either. They just would have let it be. You know, here's a 5, 6, and 7-year-old, you know, who has a very good imagination, who's saying all these kinds of things, and they would have been very gentle and never would have told me, that's stupid, you know, don't say those things. They just would have thought that was normal.
That's really wonderful.
Kids do that, you know, so that would have been their attitude. Kids do that. They certainly didn't think that I was going to other reality frames. That was not in their reality, but it was a kid, and kids do a lot of fantastical stuff. So no, I didn't get any negativity with that at all, and I pretty much kept it to myself. I took the advice I got, and I didn't share it with lots of people. It just was mine, my experience, and I understood that other people didn't have that experience. Just like if I went out of my house when I was 6 years old and got on my bicycle and drove to the park and, you know, played with some ducks or something, then I was the only one in my family that had that experience. I could go back and share it and say, oh, this is what I did. But if they just ignored it, like, yeah, oh, that's nice, then eventually I had stopped sharing it because it didn't seem to play. It wasn't their experience. They weren't going to interact with me with it. So this was the same way. I just basically kept those things to myself. I didn't have to talk about them, and I didn't have to get anybody to agree with me. That wasn't important.
I think it's really wonderful that they were so open. I mean, you've affected a lot of people with your MBT theory, and the parents of children who follow MBT and support MBT allow their children to try to understand some of these concepts. You know, you've spoken with Alexander in Sydney, Australia. On the youth fireside chat, you've spoke with Nicholas in New York and Kyle in the UK and Nala and Noah in Canada.
They're all being encouraged by their parents. Because they couldn't be in the youth fireside chat if they weren't encouraged by their parents, because their parents have to set that up and generally sit there with them while they're doing it. But yeah, I guess I'm unusual in the sense that I came from a functional family. Almost everybody I know describes this dysfunctional family that they came from, you know. Their family was just so full of fear and ego and beliefs that this was really dysfunctional. Yeah. Mine wasn't. I came from a functional family. And as I look back on it, you know, I don't have any complaints or any real sense of any dysfunction that ever took place there. You know, it was, so I guess that puts me in the, you know, maybe the 10 sigma category of people who came from a functional family. I'm not sure, just most of the people I know, you know, don't claim that. So I guess that was a little different on my part.
That was very fortunate for you and no doubt part of your plan, but kudos to the parents of children, how they encourage their children to think in a bigger picture, and how your My Big Toe has helped them.
Well, I think the big thing is just don't be negative. You don't have to really do a whole lot to support it. You just don't be negative. When your child tells you something fantastical that they just experienced, be interested. You know, talk about, oh, really? Really? 3 heads, huh? And green skin? Really? Well, what else did you do there, you know, while you were there? Just treat it, you know, just don't be negative. Treat it with, you know, the respect that you would have an adult who was trying to tell you about some interesting, unusual experience they had. You know, so it's a matter of just being open-minded, allowing the kids to have their experiences without feeling that you have to judge them for them.
Yes, you know, another researcher at the University of Virginia, Jim Tucker, works with kids who recall past lives. As you mentioned, the one child who remembered his past life as a pilot. Of course, Brian Weiss works with a lot of that as well. But there is so much evidence to another reality that parents should be encouraging when they hear these things from children.
Yeah. Now, you know, my theory supports the idea of multiple experience packets, something other people call reincarnation.
It's crucial to your theory, isn't it?
That's the point. It's a logical part of it. When you see the logical flow of it, it couldn't be any other way. It's not that this is a choice that I've picked and, that I've added this to the theory because it answers questions, it answers, this research that's been done by Brian Weiss and others. So it's not that I made it up and stuck it there because it answers those questions. That's not how it got there. It got there because it was logically necessary to be there. It's like you get to this point in the logical flow and, this next thing is a logical consequence of the last thing. And the logical consequence was that indeed we do have multiple experience packets. That was a logical consequence of the other logic that was flowing along, with this logical flow. So I didn't make this theory by, cherry picking ideas that I thought, were right. I did it just by logical process, and this multiple experience packet concept was, logically necessary for the, for the theory, for the logical flow that was there.
Along with your own experience on that, because you have the ability to tap into past life packet experiences. You're not just imagining this or constructing this.
Oh, I've done enough work in the non-physical that everything that I wrote in my book had to be verified. Everything that wasn't physical based, and most of it isn't, had to be verified by my own experience. Or I wouldn't have written about it if I couldn't have done enough experiments to convince myself that this is indeed the way it is, that this is, a fact. Now, they're subjective in the sense that it's my own experience. They're subjective facts, and I can't necessarily take anybody by the hand and show them, oh, here's the fact, because they take place in non-physical. They're not part of this physical reality. This physical reality is a subset. The larger superset, the source of this reality, appears non-physical to us from here. Of course, when you're there in that reality appears physical, and this reality doesn't. This reality then appears non-physical. Whether a reality is physical or not is not fundamental. It's just from the viewpoint of the observer. If it's a reality that's defined by a data stream that you're getting, a data stream defines a reality. That's what virtual realities are. They're computed and they're defined by a data stream. When you are receiving that data stream, then that is the reality that is physical to you. When you're not receiving that data stream, then that reality seems non-physical to you. So when we're dreaming, we're receiving a data stream from another reality frame, our dreaming reality frame. And our physical reality frame here seems non-physical to us at that point. It doesn't exist. It's not in our world. It's not in our universe. We're in a dream universe. And when we're here in this physical universe, the dream reality seems non-physical. You see, so whether a reality is physical or not is not fundamental at all. It's just from the perspective. So when you go outside of this physical universe, virtual reality, then you are in another reality space. This no longer seems physical. These other spaces can seem physical. Depends on their rule set as to how physical they seem. If you have a rule set that's very sparse, not a lot of rules, sort of like the dream reality, then you can do all kinds of things like fly and teleport and that kind of thing. And it's less physical-like. If you have another reality frame with a very strict rule set, a very strong rule set, then it's very physical, just like this reality has a strong rule set. So then every little thing follows the rules, and that makes it seem physical.
Now, could you comment on the dream reality? Because that's as valid a reality as any other.
Yes.
And for us, it is a learning place.
As is this reality.
But you cannot be harmed in this dream reality. You can make choices in this dream reality. So I think it might be important for people to know who have recurring dreams or frightening dreams, that this is simply something that is there for learning for them.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Well, there is a way that you can be harmed there, and that is that you can be frightened. You can bring that fear back here. You see, so that's one thing.
But
so
not
you
physically
can,
harmed.
you can't be physically harmed there, but you can be terrified there, and then when you come back, you can bring that terror back with you here.
Well, how could you shed some light on that how to use that to your advantage and not take that fear back with you?
Well, first you have to understand the nature of virtual reality. Okay, you get a data stream. That data stream defines your reality. When you're playing The Sims, the server, the computer server that serves that game is sending a data stream to your computer. That data stream then lights up pixels on your monitor. And you look at that monitor and interpret all those millions of pixels as a reality, as rocks and rivers and streams and, people and places and buildings and doorknobs on doors, and you see all that out of a bunch of dots of light. You make that up, you interpret it. Okay, so that's how it works. So your reality is a data stream. So when you're in the dreaming reality, you're getting a different data stream according to a different kind of rule set, which is a very loose rule set, and that's your reality. When you're in this awake, what we call our physical universe, that's a different data stream with a different rule set. One is not superior or inferior to the other, they're just different. One has a much stronger rule set than the other. So like in one you can fly, in the other one you can't. In one, you can have very buttoned down, very precise, very consistent experience. And in a dream reality, you don't have that kind of consistent experience. The consistence, jumps around. You go from one thing to another, and each night's a whole new ball game. You see, so they're just different realities, but both are as real. They both are just virtual realities that are real. When you do this out-of-body thing, which you're not really getting out of your body, that's poor terminology, but when you explore the larger consciousness system, it's another reality frame. You're getting another data stream that is interpreted by you as being things you see, hear, smell, taste, feel. You've got all the senses there that you have here, but the reason you have those senses is because you interpret the data in terms of those senses, because that's really all you know how to do from your experience. So your experience is based on, your experience base is interpreting data in terms of your senses. I saw, I heard, I smelled, I felt. Okay, I tasted. But when you're in a non-physical reality, you get data and you have to interpret it. And the way you interpret it is in terms of sight, hearing, smell, taste, feel, because that's how you interpret data. That's your database that you have to interpret it with. That's why you have sense data in the non-physical. It's not that it's another physical place that you're getting, physical input. It's just data, just like any other.
Well, the dream reality can be very detailed and
Yes.
very real. For instance, running through a field for a while, you would wake up with your legs aching and exhausted.
Sure.
It can be very real. Doesn't that lend some evidence to the nature of virtual reality? The fact that you can accept this data from a dream reality as easily and as precisely, as detailed as you can in this reality seems to lend support to the evidence that this is a virtual reality.
Yeah, this is a virtual reality, and sure, it's just another data stream. The dream reality is another virtual reality, much like this reality, and it has its own purpose. This reality has a purpose for the kind of experience you get here, a very buttoned down, consistent, causally related experience. Everything you do, affects everything else in your environment. The things you say to people affect them. The things they say to you affects you. So it's a very interactive reality frame with a tight rule set that gives us this consistent feedback, this consistent consequences to our choices. The dream reality isn't like that. There's very few consequences in a dream reality other than just very short consequences. Yes, you may fall into a deep pit, and that may be frightening, or you may even scream in your sleep or something as you do that, but then it's done and it's gone, and it doesn't really have a consequence other than the experience itself. There is no other lasting consequence like there is here. So that allows us to experience a much wider breadth and depth of things that we couldn't experience here, because here the consequences would be so severe. There the consequences aren't so severe, so we can experience there in ways we can't here. And the whole point of our being here is that we make choices in our experiencing, and we evolve or de-evolve the quality of our consciousness by the quality of our choices. So we make choices during the day when we're awake here, and then while we're sleeping, we make choices there. And there's a big difference between the two. Not only is the rule set more lax there, which gives us a wider range of choices, but when we're here, many of our choices are made through our intellect because we think that is the better choice. When we're in a dream reality, all of our choices are made from the being level, not the intellectual level. That is us. What you do in a dream, the things you're willing to do in a dream are the things you're willing to do. It's just the way you are. Now here, your intellect may keep you from doing those because of the consequences. Oh, I'd never do that here. Right, you wouldn't, because your intellect says the consequences are too stiff. I don't want those consequences. So you refrain from doing them here. But at the being level, you have that ability to do that. That is the way you are, even though you rein it in with your intellect. So that is a different place. There in the dream reality, you are authentic. And you won't be anything other than authentic. You're always authentic in that dream reality. So that's not true here. Here we can be very inauthentic. We can live in our heads and not really be who we are. So it's a very valuable experience space. That's why it's there. All virtual realities and every reality you go to, when you die here, those people who have the near-death experiences, they go into another reality frame. That's also a virtual reality. All realities in which you experience are virtual realities, because experience is dependent upon a rule set to define what happens, interactions, how energy exchanges. That's what the rule set does. So if there is no rule set, then there is no experience. So every reality that you can experience in, whether you call it lucid dreaming or out of body or remote viewing or physical reality or dream reality, they're all virtual realities. The transition reality after you die is another virtual reality. The only thing that's fundamental is consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental, everything else is virtual. So dream reality is a very valuable and just as real as any other, as is the out-of-body. Reality is just as real. The question isn't, is it real? The question that you should ask is it useful? Am I learning anything here? Is it of value? Does it help me grow up? Does it help me become, a better person? And if the answer is no, then you need to change what you're doing. If your answer is yes, then you can keep on doing it. So they're all equally real, but they're not all equally useful all the time. Each one has its own purpose, and it serves that purpose. So they're all just different.
How could someone use the experiences in a dream? How do they interpret it for themselves? Suppose they have a recurring nightmare. How should they go about handling that?
Well, the first thing they should do is look at the dream as metaphor. Okay, it's not a physical experience, it's a metaphorical experience. The elements in your dream are often not to be taken literally. They're to be taken figuratively, metaphorically. So your dream experience is, even though it seems like a physical experience, there you are, you're in a burning building, you have to rescue somebody on the next floor. That's an experience. But you have to look at that metaphorically. What is the burning building? Well, that's some high-stress situation where you have to give something of yourself and take some risk, you see. It's not necessarily a burning building. You have to look at the metaphor involved in dreams. Okay, so that's the first thing. Look at the metaphor, and if it's recurring, this is probably a reoccurring issue in your existence. It's a reoccurring set of choices that you have to make, or something you have to deal with. So if it's frightening, then you have to learn how to not be frightened by it. Let go of that fear. If it's frustrating, a lot of people have reoccurring frustration dreams where they have this goal. They have to be, they have to be packed and out of their house, by noontime. And now it's, 10 minutes to noon, and, there's 5 rooms that aren't unpacked yet, and then other people are coming to move in. And you see, there's just frustration dreams. And every time they try to speed up the process, something happens. Oh, okay, they've got a plan. They're going to, just grab everything up in a big box and take it outside. Well, then the box has a hole in it, and they can't do it. There's always something that frustrates your ability to do what you feel like you need to do. And if you don't do it, you're going to be a failure. See, now this is a dream based on a fear of being inadequate or a fear of failing, and you're just stuck in this situation, and you're supposed to deal with it. So look at what the metaphors, it's not about houses, it's not about moving, it's not about boxes with holes in it. It's about a fear of being inadequate and your ability to deal with that and accept it, that you're not perfect. Sometimes you can't get to the finish line on time, and you have to accept that and accept it gracefully. Well, that's just the way it is this time. If they're ready to move in, they're just going to have to sit out there and wait because I just can't get all this stuff out of here on time. Sorry about that. I did my best, but all my boxes had holes in them and da-da-da-da-da. So we'll do the best we can. And you have to do that without feeling failed. Just accept that that is the way it is. And as soon as you do that, that series of dreams, that reoccurring dream will disappear because you passed that level. See, it's like a video game, right? You get the same monsters that you have to fight over and over and over again until you beat the boss, and then you go on to the next level. Well, this is sort of like that. So you're going to have these dreams. They'll frustrate you. You're in charge and nobody will listen. The house is on fire and you have all these people and you tell them the house is on fire. They just keep talking to each other, making the sandwich, watching TV, and you're jumping up and down and nobody's listening to you. Well, that's a dream of being irrelevant. That's a fear about your irrelevancy, that people don't take you seriously, that you get blown off. So you need to deal with that fear. So look at the dream for the lesson in it and look at it metaphorically. And that's what you can do, because that'll point out problems you have to work with. And then start working with them in this reality. Because you have that same problem here, or you wouldn't be dreaming about it. It's a problem with you, with your consciousness. And your consciousness is experiencing here, and experiencing there, and experiencing in other realities. And that consciousness, if it has a problem, those problems show up in all those realities. You see? So learn from it. Take that information and work with it and find the lesson and take it seriously. Try to have an intent to not be that way, to not have to be perfect, to not feel incompetent. And when things work that you just can't be the winner, you can't do it, you can't get out of your house on time, whatever, well, accept it, fess up to it, admit it, and go on. You see, without any sense of, oh, I failed. Oh, it's awful. I knew I couldn't do it. See, all of that's self-defeating. So that's the lesson for you to learn, and these dreams will go away.
That's
so
really nice.
You can learn a lot from your dreams.
That is really nice. This example took us to an interesting turn. To finish, are there any other experiences or events that help shape your worldview?
Well, yes, there's a few I can think of that probably were important. The first out-of-bodies that I did, that we discussed earlier when I was 5, 6, and 7, that created a set of knowledge that I had that this reality was larger. By the time I got to 8, 9, and 10, though, I forgot all of that. All that was gone. I didn't think about it anymore, but I still could contact the non-physical to find out things I wanted to know. I still had connection to the databases and to other entities. And I never lost that. All the way through, you know, elementary school, you know, high school, college, graduate school. If I had an issue that I needed to find out something, some big picture thing, you know, and some crossroads or some other thing came up, I could always get dependable answers to those questions, to dependable information. But I never thought of it as, who was that? Why are they talking to me? Where did that come from? It just was like, it's just part of my reality. It's always been there. You can always just pose a question and get an answer. So it didn't seem paranormal. It didn't seem anything but normal. Life's just like that. And I figure everybody can do that. Everybody has answers. You can have conversations and you can talk about things in your life and what's going on, and you can have a regular conversation. It's not just getting an intuitive download. It's often a conversation that you can have. And that there's always been this support system, if you will, that has helped me out, taken care of me. Sometimes the support system hollered, duck, and I did. I'd pay attention because I knew it was always right. So I'd duck, and sure enough, I avoided a disaster. You know, that sort of thing. Now that's just a metaphor. You know, it really wasn't with ducking, but it would tell you something to do or not to do, or don't go there. Don't drive home that way tonight. Take the long route. Yeah, it's a scenic route. Yeah, see if you see something different, you know, and I'd pay attention and I'd go and I'd find a terrible accident there where, you know, 15 cars piled up and 3 people got killed. So those kinds of things happen to me regularly. So I felt that I did have this guidance, this, I don't know, it wasn't always guidance, it's just information that was available. And I had this help that got me out of trouble lots of times. Things would just work out when they needed to.
You mentioned that it left you at one point to allow you to be more normal and
yeah,
to go
no, that
through
was
school.
when I was getting transition, and you know, it's probably at the 7 point, you know, the 5, 6, and 7. When at the end of that, where I stopped going out of body there, stopped having those experiences, I was told, you need to grow up like a normal kid. You don't need to be weird because that will affect how you grow up. You know, that will change you, and you just need to be normal.
But
so
you were
at
still...
that, the door was shut on the out-of-body experiences at that point.
But not the
but
guides.
the energy flow was
Okay. That was always
there. That never went away, but I wasn't able to
I
explore anymore. But
What
I always
kinds of
had the energy
questions?
exchange.
What kind of
all
what
kinds of
questions did you ask?
You know, there's questions just about, you know, life in general. You know, some of them are in my book. I had questions when I was 14, whether or not, you know, there was a woman going to be in my life. You know, 14's a frustrating age for a young guy. And I was told yes. I was told she was only 2 years old. I was told that, you know, she lived in another state, and I had, you know, no knowledge of her existence. And I was told that I would meet this girl when I was 35. I was told times how many children we would have, the sexes of the children. I was told when I got married the first time that it wasn't going to last, but it needed to happen. It was a growth period I needed to go through. And I felt really bad about that going into it, thinking that, this is, you know, I shouldn't do it. And they said, no, you got to do it. It's good for you, good for her. Both of you will learn a lot, and it'll be time to move on. And sure enough, it happened just like that. And it worked out. And, you know, so these kinds of things, just life choices, things that I wondered about that I'd ask. Sometimes it was just wondering on my part. Sometimes it was because I was at a crossroads, like should I go get married or not? But I always got information that was right on, that was valuable. I've had things that I was told that, you know, took 25 years before they came true, but they always do. So
I suspect the same guides are with you when you were doing your writing your book and doing your physics experiments?
Yes, and that's a good thing to talk about. Yes, the same individuals I interacted with when I was 4, 5, you know, or 5, 6, and 7 are the same that I interact with today. They've been consistent. They've been, you know, should I say, you know, consciousness that I know, that I interact with, friends of mine, acquaintances, you know, best friends, whatever. They've always been around, and it's the same group, been consistent. Those who came and helped me get out of body and did that when I was, those elementary school ages, still a part of my life. So that was continuous. But it's not like I get downloads of information. It's not like I write my book as automatic writing or I get told what to write. It never has worked that way. I always have to make all my own choices and come to all my own conclusions. Nobody from the non-physical tells me anything other than things that help me make my own choices. So I don't get, well, let's say in writing the books, I didn't get that as a download from the non-physical. I got that because I researched it, because I did the science in the non-physical, because I'm a physicist, because I worked at it for 35 years. Doing all that research in the non-physical is slow, tedious work. I did that over 35 years before I started to write. So it took a lot of effort, and I had to figure it out. I had to understand that this was a virtual reality. I had to come to that. I still come to conclusions. Like I say, the books were published for a couple of years before I realized that the same principles that explain consciousness explain physics. And it was only, a year and a half ago that I came up with this set of quantum mechanics experiments. So things are always coming, but all of these are things that I figure out on my own from what I know. I have to do the analysis. I have to figure it out. And do I get help and nudges? Sure. I'll get nudges. I'll get working down, and this is even in my career as a physicist. I'll be working down a path towards some simulation, and I'll get an intuitive message that says, this isn't the right way to go. And I have learned to pay attention to those. And I go, oh, why not? And I'll get an answer. Well, it's not going to work out. If you go down that path, you're going to find yourself boxed in. And I'll think about it a while, and I'll say, you're right. I wouldn't have noticed that till I actually got boxed in, but now I see, that that's right. So I get a little help sometimes like that. And I have aha moments, which could indeed be, the system giving me a little prod. So I can't say that I never get any help, but I have to figure it all out on my own.
You have to pay attention.
I have to pay attention, and I have to figure it out on my own, and my helps are nudges, not downloads, not dialogue, not things to write down. I don't ever get whole things like that. I'll get a nudge. I'll just get a piece, and it may be a missing piece, which is good to get. But yes, I get missing pieces. I get encouragement if I'm on the right track, and I say, well, this seems like a good way to go, and I'll get it. Yeah, that's the right way to go. Keep going.
Well, that's great.
So I get some of that sort of help out of it, but I'm the one that has to figure out what's the right way to go. And it's always my choice. And if I screw it up, then that was because of my choices, not because I got bad information. I'm always very skeptical of the information I get. I say keep an open mind and always be skeptical. I'm skeptical of everything I get. When I get a nudge, I don't just do it unless it's an urgent nudge like duck. And then I figure if it's bogus, it won't hurt anything if I just duck. I may look a little silly to everybody who's wondering why I just, duck my head. But I'll pay that price of looking silly because I know it's helped me get out of a lot of jams. But if it's something about a decision I have to make that affects other people, I don't do it because I get a download. I make the decision based on what I know. I'm skeptical of anything that comes to me that way. I have to think about it and decide that it is the right way to go. And but it's helpful to have these other opinions, but I still have to do it. Otherwise, it's not mine. You see, otherwise I'm following directions, and then I won't understand it. If somebody else leads you there, you don't understand it. If you have to get there on your own, you have to figure it out, or it's not yours. You don't own it. You say, well, that's the difference. You have to own it. If you're going to talk about these things, you have to own them. So that's why the larger system couldn't just dictate this to me, because it would just been like the people that write down what Ra tells them or what Seth tells them. They're just writing it down. they don't own it. It's not theirs. They're just taking dictation. But that's not something that I'm doing. I have to be able to explain it. I have to be able to build on it. I have to be able to know it as mine. Otherwise, it's not going to work. If I wrote down and said, oh, yeah, okay, I dictated the stuff that, quantum mechanics is really, a logical science. You just need to, if nobody paying attention to that, you have to be able to explain why that works, where it comes from. It has to be logical. So to be logical, you have to own it. So I have to own all the stuff that I've done. But I've gotten nudges and helps, and I've had my life saved, half a dozen times by paying attention to these things. And I've had the synchronicity all the time, where just what I need falls in front of my feet just as I need it. And I've had those kinds of helps. But all of that's in the margin under the cover of plausible deniability. And I still have to make the choices. But
clearly,
yes, there's been lots of help, no doubt, that led to these books. And it also is the time's right. I think if I'd written these books, 30 or 40 years ago, the time wouldn't have been right. Had I waited for another, well, I'm not going to live that long, but if I waited for another, 50 years to write them, which would make me really, really old, the time would have passed. So being here at this time is also part of a plan that this is the right time to do this. And that's why I get some guidance on how to do it.
It does seem to be just the right time. And clearly you are not just an ordinary physicist. This is why you are able to write You're My Big Toe. Thank you, Tom, for this interview. We've hit some interesting points, and I hope it's illustrated a little bit about how you were able to write You're My Big Toe.
Well, thank you, Donna. I always enjoy my interviews with you, and we always do things that nobody else does in interviews, so it makes them non-repetitive for those left-brainers.
That's a good thing, then. Thank you again.